In this video, I'd like to talk in more detail about creating function objects. To start us off, I'm going to create a function called add, and I'm going to do this a little bit differently than you would normally create functions. I'm going to use the new operator with the function constructor. So this constructor function takes any number of initial arguments here, which will be the named parameters of the function. And then as a final parameter, it takes the function body, and that will be a string that will be converted into a function body. When I save this document over in the debugger, let's take a look at this new add function. The first thing to note is that we've created a new function here. It has a name of anonymous because we didn't give it a name, and it has these two named parameters a and b, and then the function body we created with this string here. So it's just going to return the result of adding these two parameters. The second thing to notice is that the add function is just an object, which has properties and values. The difference between this and regular functions, or regular objects, is that we can call this object. So if I call add with the parameters 1 and 2, we'll get back the result 3. The next thing to notice is that there is a prototype property on this object. And it points up to another object here, which comes from the function constructor prototype object. If you're unfamiliar with this concept, you can go and take a look at the objects class, and you'll learn about how property inheritance works. But a quick recap, we can take a look at this function prototype by typing console.dir and then passing function.prototype, and you'll be able to inspect the object. So if we expand this, you can see all the properties and methods that we see up here. Okay, let's go back to the source code. I want to show you a couple more things about this idea. We're using the new operator here and the function constructor to actually create a new function. And when we do this, we're putting this function object on the heap. So we're creating an object in memory, and it goes on to something called the heap. So that's just a memory space for all of our objects. This time where the function object is created and then added to the heap is called creation time. We'll just call it create or creation time. So this is when the function is created and added to memory. So as we go through different videos, you might hear this terminology, create time versus the other kind of time, which is call time. That's when we actually call the function. So create time is when we create the function, and call time is when we actually call it. So what we're doing here is creating a new function and then assigning it to this variable called add. I've commented out the above, and now let's create the same function using syntax that you're probably more familiar with. So to start us off, I'll create a variable called add and assign it to a new function that takes a named parameter a and a named parameter b, and a function body that returns the result of adding those two. When I save and go back to the console, if we take a look at the resulting add function, let's look at a couple of key things. First, notice that the function here doesn't have a name. It's just anonymous, even though we've assigned it to this variable with an identifier of add. The second thing to note is that this is an object just like what we created using the new keyword or the new operator with the function constructor. And then finally, notice that the prototype property points up to function.prototype just like before. And if we follow the prototype chain all the way to the top, you can see eventually it ends with the object prototype. And so just like before, where we created the add function with using the new keyword with the constructor function here, in this form we're creating a new function and setting up its prototype chain to inherit from object. And just like before, using this syntax here, we're creating a new object, a function object, and adding it to the heap. So this function here is created right in line in our code here. So this is kind of like using object literal syntax, where we're creating a function by just using its literal syntax in our code. More specifically, this way of declaring or creating a function is called a function expression. So let's comment that out. The final way to create this function is to just use a function declaration, where we're not assigning it to a particular variable, we're just using the function keyword and then naming the function. And we can provide the same body here. Now, because I'm using Meteor as the runtime, we won't be able to access this function inside of the console. But you can take my word for it that this function would do the same thing as the function up here. So there's a couple subtle differences between creating functions this way versus the constructor function up here, which we'll get into in more detail when we get to topics like scope and hoisting. Lastly, I want to really drive home the fact that these functions are new objects that we can do things with. Just like regular objects, when we create a new one and set up its prototype chain, we can call methods or properties, access properties that exist in that prototype chain. And we can do the same thing with function objects. So, for example, if we wanted to add a function directly to this function, we could do that. So I'll say add.sayHello. And then over in the browser, if I say add.sayHello, I call a function that exists on the add object, even though add itself is a function. Now, if you recall, the add object's prototype pointer will point to the function prototype object. So let's take a look in the console.dir. And if you want to take a look and make sure, you could say, does the function prototype object equal our add's prototype pointer? And it does. So if we want a method to be available to all functions, we could put it on the function prototype object. To demonstrate that, what I'll do is get rid of this function below. And what I want to do is to be able to call a function on this new resulting add object. I'm going to call it log. So what's going to happen is this function is going to get called on this function here at the time that it's created. And then the result that's returned will get assigned to this variable. This is a little confusing, so just try to follow along and you can try it yourself in the debugger. So what we need to do is to make this function available to be callable on all function objects. And to do that, we can add a method to the function prototype. Now, inside of this function, the original function will be the thisarg, because the this keyword will point to the function object itself. So what we're going to do is to return a new function. And what we'll do is log to the console some kind of logging message. It's not important. Right now I'm just trying to show you how you can call a method on another function. And then we'll just return the result of calling the original function. Now in this case, we need to pass along some arguments. I'm going to show you a trick that we'll talk about in more detail in another video. But to make this work, you're going to call the apply method and then pass this and then any arguments. Don't worry about how this works for now. Okay, if we look at the add function now, notice it looks a little bit different because we've called this log function, which ended up returning a new function. So now if I call add 1 and 2, we log a message to the console and then we get back our result of 3. If you didn't understand all of that, it's okay. I just wanted to show you that when we use this function syntax like this, we are actually creating a new object. and we can call functions or access properties on that object. I also wanted to show you that this object inherits from the function prototype. And so if we want to make a property or method available to all functions, we can do it here. But be careful because you might be overriding other people's methods from other frameworks or from the natives. In this somewhat advanced example, what we did was to wrap the original function with a new function that logs some message to the console and then returns the result of calling the original function. And this entire object here is returned and then assigned to the add variable. So then over here, what we can do is to just call that add variable or add identifier just like we did before. In this video, we looked first at how to create functions, and specifically the difference between create time and call time. Then we looked at how all functions are just objects. So when we create a new function, we're actually creating an object and putting it on the heap. Then we looked at how we can add properties and methods to that object. Then we looked at how the object inherits from the function prototype. To understand these concepts, I really recommend going into the debugger console in Chrome and playing around by creating your own functions and adding some functions to the function prototype. That'll give you a really good intuitive sense of how these function objects work.